couple of years ago, I was renting a house directly through the owner. We were on a periodic agreement when the owner fell ill and required the house back. He wanted to give us 2 weeks' notice to vacate, so of course we panicked. The Sydney rental market is challenging under the best of conditions. I called my aunt, who told me about the Tenants Union, so I gave them a call. The friendly gentleman on the phone gave me some advice and told me that there was more information on their website. There I found a wealth of information and fact sheets, which I have been using as my essential manual ever since.
I just think it's really critical that tenants have access to independent advice, so advice that's not related to government, not coming from their landlord, not coming from someone who might have a conflicted reason to give them bad advice, but truly independent advice.
People around Redfern were having problems with their landlords and real estate agents. We're talking mainly about private tenants who were being ripped off for their bond money, impossible to get repairs done, evictions which in those days were through the local court. However, lockouts were quite legal, so it wasn't uncommon for a tenant to come home and find they're locked out.
It was before all our property was gentrified, so a lot of it was in very poor condition. It wasn't that unusual to find a house that just had one water tap to the property and that covered bathroom, kitchen, everything.
So we were still operating on tenancy legislation that was about 100 years old at that stage. So there was a big amount of improvement that needed to come in to make things a little bit easier for tenants.
Back then there was no legal aid, no forms of assistance for anybody who was doing it tough in that way. People had to either fight their own battles or just see what they could sort out.
South Sydney Community Aid was successful in attracting some funding from the then Commonwealth Social Welfare Commission to run a demonstration project to establish a tenants advice service and see where that led. And out of that project came the first Tenants' Rights Manual.
We were having meetings of tenants, we were supporting people to squat in the vacant property. We were also running anti-eviction campaigns.
We came from a broad range of backgrounds, but with a strong commitment to housing justice. We worked on these issues and came together in the Shelter Tenancy Working Party. That was established in 1975. However, those involved in the Tenancy Working Party felt that there was a strong need for a separate organisation of tenants in its own right. And that led to the Tenants Union being formed.
Eventually the Tenants Union did pick up some money from the Legal Aid Commission actually for a project worker, and they advertised a job and I applied for it and got it.
The role of that worker was initially to establish a network of tenants advice services, basically staffed by volunteers, and then to resource those volunteers. Also trained paid workers with community organisations to take on the role of providing tenancy advice.
For example, there was a woman from the Country Women's Association in Woodburn up on the northern rivers of New South Wales who rang us and said, I'm sick of working in my neighbourhood centre and having this amount of tenancy problems come through, can you people help me? And so we brought her down to Sydney and gave her our 2-day training course on how to be a tenants advice service, and she took it away from there.
This particular client who I assisted, this was their house. Now we documented that sort of experience, multiply that by the experiences of tenants across those 40-odd tenants advice services. That provided us with very good evidence when we were making submissions and arguing for changes to the law.
So I think it took us about 2 years to set the network up, and that was a very exciting time. We had a kit of stuff. Okay, here's how you run an organisation. here's your tenants advice service in a box. And we gave it to them. And when their people were employed, then I trained them.
We've survived and we've flourished.
The job of a tenants advocate is a lot of phone advice, a lot of talking to people, hearing about their issues and helping them resolve it. And then as you get more experienced, you start going to tribunal, you start actually running cases for people as well as with them.
So our service covers approximately 55% of New South Wales. So it's quite a large area. We've got 4 different offices. We have one in Armidale, one in Tamworth, one in Dubbo and one in Broken Hill. One of the major difficulties that we face is providing the service across that vast area. There's many occasions the TU's there a phone call away, I suppose. So legal backup from them, it could be just in the form of one case discussion, it might be an ongoing case discussions, but yes, it's a fantastic service.
We provide mostly training on the tenancy law and tenancy related subjects. So we've got training for new tenant advocates about the basics of tenancy law and tribunal and basics for the jobs. We've got training on social housing, on hoarding, on mental health, on how the tenancy law connects to the criminal law, and a whole other range of training.
See, I'm a tenant rep in public housing, and I believe that studying the Residential Tenancies Act and doing an advocacy course through the Tenants Union of New South Wales will equip me better to answer the questions that I get from my constituency.
The other training that has been going for a while now, I think, is the community legal education training. It's always been a great strength of the Tenants Union and is very much part of that model, that devolved model of providing the skills to those community workers, and I think all the research says that when people have legal issues they don't necessarily go to lawyers, they go to community workers.
Housing is an integral part of need for Aboriginal people. You know, we were placed on missions, removed from our lands. We had no housing into the 19th century, 1920s, 30s, that we were still living in tin humpies, 40s, 50s, tin humpies on missions. And then governments started to move towards, housing for Aboriginals, their HFA program, the Aboriginal Housing Office. The next link in the chain was, there's Aboriginal land rights, housing, and obviously those other services that mainstream Australians, usually have around health and all that sort of thing, and then tenancy. And it was around about the 1990s, 92, 93, that a couple of colleagues of mine, Ivan Simon being one of them, Tom Slocky and myself, were approached about, the opportunity to start to set up and think about Aboriginal tenancy services across New South Wales. So we're up and running, and we obviously very, very well supported by the Tenants Union, and that's been the case from the word go.
One of the other, I think, significant things about the Tenants Union is the strength of the Aboriginal or Koori tenancy services. They are all Aboriginal managed and Aboriginal staffed, and I think that's quite significant and is a real privilege to be able to work with the tenants advice services on Aboriginal issues and to learn from them. And at their encouragement, the TU was able to get funding for an Aboriginal legal officer.
But most people think of renters as students, as younger people. Really what's emerging is older renters, people who by the time they hit 40, 50, 60 probably would have bought a house and really by the 50s and 60s they probably would have paid off that house 20, 30 years ago. But increasingly people are getting towards pension age and they're still in the private rental market.
My job at the Tenants Union is for 2 days. 1 day is backing up workers across the network of tenants advice and advocacy services on older persons issues, which includes protected tenants. The second day is running on policy issues relating to older tenants.
Another landmark reform was the Boarding Houses Act. The Tenants Union had previously, as part of our marginal renters campaign, had put up a new model of law reform for marginal renters. It drew on the ACT's occupancy principles model. It was especially suitable to dealing with the wide range of housing situations or rental housing situations that are otherwise excluded from residential tenancy legislation. In the Boarding Houses Act, we got a partial version of this. We got occupancy principles, but without the broad coverage, so they apply to residents of boarding houses. So there's still more to be done on getting the broad coverage, because there are people who are excluded from the Residential Tenancies Act who are also excluded from the Boarding Houses Act, but whose situations could be really usefully dealt with by the occupancy principles.
The Boarding House Education Project really is about letting people know that that is available and that it's a viable way to resolve a dispute. It's not going to apply to everyone, and that's part of the work in progress.
In New South Wales, we have, according to government figures, around 34,000 people live in residential parks as their homes. In November last year, so 1st of November 2015, we got a brand new act, which is the Residential Land Lease Communities Act, and it's significantly changed a lot of the rights and responsibilities of both operators and of park residents. We've been embarking on a big community education project, and we've also developed a whole new suite of resources to advise residents about the law. We have a legal officer at the Tenants Union who deals with matters that have gone higher than the tribunal, so gone into higher jurisdictions such as the District Court or the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, the Land and Environment Court.
I think one thing that is very special about the Tenants Union is that it gives tenants the capacity to argue for their own rights and to be heard, so that very often housing issues for low-income people get treated simply in a welfare paradigm, which leaves often the punter without a voice. Whereas what the Tenants Union's role so clearly is giving that person and that group of people a clear voice about their housing and a capacity to assert their rights under the law. So it's a different paradigm, a different discourse, and it matters a great deal.
It's been a flagship publication of the Tenants Union for longer than I've been around, and it's been edited and rewritten a number of times.
Tenants' Rights Manual really is the go-to for anyone interested in tenancy law, whether a tenant themselves or anyone advocating for someone with tenancy issues. We've been lucky enough in the last edition to partner with the Legal Information Access Centre at the State Library, and in the last year we've had 90,000 unique visitors. That project was funded by the Law and Justice Foundation, and we're really excited that we've now updated for the latest changes to the law.
I think the Tenants' Rights Manual is something that certainly sits, I have a copy at home and on the shelf at work, and that is often a well-thumbed volume, very easy to read, very easy to understand, and I'm guessing a Bible to all the tenants' advice and advocacy services.
The tenants.org.au website has been running for about 15 years now, and one of the most popular parts of that website is the fact sheets. We have 500,000 unique people visiting it every year. So the fact sheets, we've tried to make sure that we get out to as many people as possible. So that includes fact sheets that are targeted to the Aboriginal community. That's been in conjunction with Aboriginal services, Aboriginal workers in community who, they come to us and they tell us how these things should look. But we also do multiple languages. A series of fact sheets has been translated into 10 different languages.
It's more or less the journal of record of the battle for tenants' rights in New South Wales. It reports on the work of the Tenants Union itself, but also of the advocacy services, the TAP network. Yeah? It's always carried stories of tenants themselves. So it's always been important to ground the work of the Tenants Union and the advocacy services and law reform particularly in the real life experience of tenants.
Tenants, like people who own their own house, are looking for security. Something like the Tenants Union is the only way they're going to achieve this in the current political and economic climate.
Strategic litigation is aimed at testing the law in order to clarify or change it, and we do it to try to improve the lot of tenants generally. We managed in the Supreme Court to win a case that clarified the landlord's strict liability to repair the premises properly. The landlord in that case was liable for the damage done to the tenant's interests by incomplete and bad repair work.
We sort of sit in between government or sort of, the high-level policy and lawmaker and the grassroots, if you like. So we're kind of looking in both directions, giving information and feedback from one to the other and back again. I mean, at the moment, there's three kind of big policy discussions that are happening. So there's a review of the Residential Tenancies Act. We're talking again about security of tenure. We're talking again about getting rid of no grounds notices of termination. We've influenced that discussion in a way. Whether or not we influence the outcome remains to be seen. There's also there's a new strategic document around how social housing is going to be developed and managed over the next decade, and some of the points that are raised in that document have certainly been influenced by work that we've done, advocacy that we've been doing over a long time. And then there's also current discussions around tax reform at both the state and federal level. I like to think that we have been influential there.
They've got vast experience in dealing in the tenancy area and real life experience of dealing with the problems that tenants have, and that's invaluable. I think it's testament to the Tenants Union that we have some of the regulation in this area. I'm sure we wouldn't have it had it not been for the advocacy of an organisation like the Tenants Union.
I guess my first involvement was not long after I became a public housing, social housing tenant, and realised that there was a bit of a culture within housing at the time for people to sort of be told, shut up and be grateful. And of course I was infinitely grateful for my housing property, but I didn't feel that I was required to shut up in terms of what I saw was certain things that perhaps needed to be addressed, especially in the community that I live in, which is a very high density, high rise public housing estate. So I got involved in some of the tenant participation activities that were happening around in the social housing sphere, and then through those was introduced to the Tenants Union and their work.
Millers Point is a good example. We've done research and given advice in the Millers Point questions. I'm aware that there have been TAP workers who have been on the ground in Millers Point helping people with what's happening in the changes for those people, and we've given backup advice to those advocates as well, and been a supporter of the movements within the community at Millers Point.
For people on low incomes, the possibility of getting affordable rental housing is almost impossible. The Tenants Union is actually trying to work in concert with other organisations like Shelter New South Wales, change the situation of lack of affordable rental housing.
The TU's been talking about tax reform. Our tax system encourages speculation in housing, positively encourages it. And it's speculation in housing that has driven house prices up, house prices for purchase, and it's also screwed up the rental market.
You've got a different challenge now, the TU has, in that there's an increase in the number of people renting, but they're not all very poor people as they were back then. Because our housing's become so expensive, many middle income people are opting long term for rental simply because they can't afford the alternatives, not because they don't necessarily want the alternatives. And so the challenge for the Tenants Union is to muster that. And to be able to speak not just for the low-income tenants but for all tenants, because the interests of those people for well-priced, well-located property in good nick are not dissimilar to that of the poorer households.
Over the last few years, increasingly people are becoming aware that the international students of Sydney and New South Wales are finding it really difficult to find accommodation that's appropriate, that's safe, that's clean and secure. On a number of levels, there are issues around how we house people who we've asked to come here really because they're contributing a lot to our economy, to our tertiary education sort of systems, and then we're not housing them safely or affordably.
There's a few items of unfinished business in tenancy law reform. Getting rid of no grounds termination is the enduring one. If something as substantial and important in a person's life as losing their house, if that's going to happen, they should get a reason for it. That's a simple proposition that I think most people can accept. There's been a number of changes to the law to specifically targeted at social housing tenants to increase the obligations that are on them and to increase the prospect of some action being taken against them under tenancy law. And the TU's done a good job in the past in mitigating the worst of those effects. As long as we have this marginalised system that can be kicked around for political purposes, it may keep happening.
We can see that the laws in Australia are quite different from other places around the world, and it's time we fell into step with other countries, and we will discover that if you give strong laws and encourage investment, long-term investment in renting, that the world doesn't collapse. Indeed, it progresses. I think, to bring about change, you need a whole range of strategies and organisations. You need the community education and awareness. You need to test the legal boundaries. You need to influence policy. People talking over the back fence to each other about the issues that matter and what people can do about those issues. The TU will continue to have a role somewhere on that continuum, and it may change over time.
We often play really long games. We've got things on our agenda that we'd like to see change that have been on our agenda since 1976. Every victory is important. Some of our biggest victories are still yet to come.